myself. So I am not going to formally introduce the plenary panel members today, because you can see that in your programs. But I am going to give a little bit of background on what we're trying to achieve over the next hour and a half or so, and then we'll go through that process. The title of this, as I see in the program, is North America's Post-COVID, Post-USMCA Trade Agreement. But it stems from a project that myself and Dimitri Anastakis from the University of Toronto embarked upon almost 2 years ago now, with some of the people in this room, to do an analysis and put together an edited collection on the North American automotive industry since NAFTA. Well, since that time, we've tried to be a little more creative with the book as it's gone to print. So the current title of it, and I'm mentioning this to you because if you have a better idea, more catchy, so that the University of Toronto Press that's going to publish the thing can move up the run from 12 to 15%, perhaps. We've now called it the North American automotive industry, from NAFTA to USMCA and beyond. A little bit Star Warsy, I suppose. The battles for fair share, and the battle for fair share, particularly from the perspective of Canada and Mexico, and that's the perspective that we're bringing today, because there's lots of and the organizers asked us to focus on Canada and Mexico, because understandably in Ann Arbor at this particular conference, there's going to be a lot of profile of what's going on in the US auto industry. Now, this collection that we put together, and the reason we put together is, in our impression, is it's a little bit past due. It builds on the work from 29 years ago by Maureen Malott on an edited collection on the North American automotive industry. Sidney Weintraub and Christopher Sands were busy in 1998 with something similar, but there's really been this vacuum of works that involve all of the three participants in the North American Free Trade Agreement, or the USMCA, as the case may be. So that's why we put this together, and we've made effort to bring together an even perspectives from those three jurisdictions. But this notion of fair share we found particularly relevant, and it's part of the language that's been a part of the North American automotive industry in general, and frankly, the Canadian automotive industry in particular, since back to the 1965 Auto Pact that Flavio Volpe spoke of this morning. Always this notion in Canada where we feel that, you know, we're the very, very, very small brother, or the kitten sleeping beside the elephant, of how do we get our fair share in a integrated North American industry. So these two slides will be very familiar with US, Canada, and Mexico participants here, but it does give you a sense of, on the left-hand side, North American production volume and share. Volume fairly stable, with, you know, some obvious exceptions over the past 30 years, but a slightly declining share from the US, a declining share from Canada in red. It's actually gone down even more. Again, Flavio's presentation notwithstanding, we've gone from 3 million production in Canada, for example, as recently as the year 2000, which was frankly the high water mark, to just over 1 million last year. So there are some good news stories in the industry in Canada, but the general trend has been downward. Last year being, you know, starting to come back a little bit, but it's going down. And then meanwhile, the ascension of Mexico. And in the last session I was at somebody referenced Ross Perot's giant sucking sound analogy, and that giant suck, and it was quickly dismissed as not being entirely relevant, but it has been relevant to a significant degree in Canada, and a lot of that production the low-cost location in an integrated market was Canada, when the integrated North American market was Canada and the US. But with Canada, US, and Mexico, the obvious low-cost option is Mexico. And you can see another way to manage this, assess in a real simplistic view, this notion of fair share is production to share sales ratio. So from 1965 until 2020, Canada made more vehicles than in Canada than it sold. Last year in 2020, it slipped below that 1-to-1 ratio. In the meantime, Mexico, for example, has gone up to just around 3-to-1 over the period of NAFTA. So you see this juxtaposition that occurs in the industry over time. This is why this matters, not just in North America, but elsewhere. And we've heard a lot of over even just this morning, but this builds on some work that a lot of you have had some role in over the past while, trying to categorize the global auto industry. And we do that between core, semi-periphery, and integrated periphery countries. The core being, as you can see in the bottom half here, what their key attributes are. Homegrown, the existence of a homegrown indigenous automaker, heavy R&D spending, labor costs, levels of foreign ownership, and the prevalence of the homegrown top 100 suppliers. And we can, and I think it's fairly self-evident to this group about how those attributes shake out between core countries, primarily the US, Germany, etc., and integrated periphery, and that list is a lot longer today, for example, than it was at the outset of NAFTA. And then in the middle are these countries like Canada, semi-peripheries, with a primary source of competitive advantage. It's fairly evident in core countries, it's power. And it's fairly evident in the integrated periphery, it's low cost. And so what people like me are looking at, and Basil to a degree as well, or to a significant degree as well, are trying to find a source of competitive advantage in these semi-periphery countries, either because they don't have the source of power and they are not low cost. And so how do you define their competitive advantage? So over the next little while, not too long, we're going to look at some of the chapters and some of the sections that focus on Canada or Mexico in this collection of 14 chapters, bringing in 23 authors from around, and some of them are here, not just Alex Covarrubias, who's here, and not just Basil or Bertha, who are waiting to present, but also others like Thomas Clear, who's here, Kristen Zichek, who's here. Who else is here that's part of that? Yeah, and so there's lots of people that have contributed to this, but we're going to talk about 4 different sections. And the first one up is Alex, and you're going to talk about the USMCA and third generation labor agreements.
So this work is a work of mine with Melanie Dufour from University of Montreal. And our focus is on labor issues in the USMCA. We think that labor is back on the front stage, and we stress that we need to take into account the different environments and situations that are putting labor in this new stage. And from the labor perspective, the USMCA has these objectives: keeping investment and jobs in America, taking out wages from the competitiveness equation, introducing a new labor model in Mexico, or a model that works, a real labor model that works. And we question if this is happening and how it's happening. And we take a look in the Latin American experience, because there has been 6 free trade agreements in the past between US and 11 Latin American countries. And they start including labor as a part of the equation. So there are many things to say about Mexico. In terms of industrial and labor relations, we can put it in brief that in Mexico, it has not been such a thing like an industrial relations system that works in any level. There has not been a labor relations system or model that works in any level that we know. And Mexico became famous in terms of labor relations because it's that we call protection labor contracts, where the contract that called CB collective bargaining is in place. And just Greg, and we were talking about before firm start working, right? And people say, this is great. I mean, from the management perspective, say, oh, this is fantastic. Going to Mexico is not finding any problem at all regarding labor. So, this is quite important from our perspective. There has been 3 generations. We identified 3 generations in the relationship between US and countries related to free trade. The first one takes us back to NAFTA with the labor side agreement. What is the place of labor with us? In NAFTA, what is just put aside. A second generation comes to with this all 6 free trades that take place after NAFTA, including Chile, CAFTA, in Central American, Dominican Republic, Colombia, Peru, Panama, and so on. So, where labor start to gaining prominence, they introduce fundamental ILO labor rights and start exploring different conditions for labor and for exploring sanctioning if they don't comply with these rights. The 3rd generation is USMCA. Our point is that this is not only important for North America. This is important for the whole world and the auto industry in general globally, because they are tying, for the first time, they are tying trade to access to labor compliance. And this thing is generating a big discussion across America and beyond. There is a big discussion right now in Europe, for instance, regarding this kind of approach. So, and there is a lot of information, as I say, and from NAFTA that just put in place one value content rule to the USCM that has many rules, and 4 of them that are key, including for the first time, a labor content added value rule. Can I continue or how is because yeah, you are passionate from this morning, but I'm just kidding. No, it's okay. They put in place this USMCA rapid response labor mechanism, which is for the first time. If you review the free trade agreements across the world, not only America, you don't find something like this. And it's an elaborated mechanism, which includes that they can review the labor situation that in any firm, just because somebody else and say any worker, any single worker can say, hey, they are there are some violations here. They are not respecting this labor right, and they can ask to start a rapid response labor mechanism. So at the end of this review process that it can include panels from the 3 different countries. At the end, if they find that the violation of labor right is in place, they can suspend the access of the market for the market of the implied firm. So, okay. These are in just the last 2 years, the cases related to the auto sector that has been struggling in putting the place. GMC law that probably everybody hear about it. And GMC law became the most observed surveil case in the history of labor, in the clash of labor and management in the sector, because everybody was in there observing what exactly is going on in GMC law. And then Nissan Aguascalientes, GM Ramos Arizpe, and so on. So the point is that there is some legitimization process going on, mandated by the USMCA, and in some cases, the incumbent unions, the CTM that most of you probably know about it, that lead this protection contract, they have been losing ground. They have been losing in some case, whereas in other case, they are winning and keeping its dominance. The point is, most of these cases has been placed by the US mechanisms. And in the key cases has been placed for the US mechanisms. And we raise the question if it can be the way, the path to transform industrial relations in Mexico. Let's see, I'm going to finish in just a few moments. So at the end, if we put some numbers, and you're gonna see that less than 1% of traditional labor contracts has been rejected, which means that after this big struggle in cases that I just mentioned, most of the traditional contracts has been and remain in place. The question is possible to transform an industrial relations system from outside? This is, they call it sabotage plus.
Just to make sure. Make sure that it does not.
Okay, which impact? So, put it in brief. From NAFTA, first generation of labor arrangement, that we can conclude after 25 years of NAFTA, the impact on labor was known, to the second generation across Latin America, where the labor impact was kind of scanned, to the current situation of the third generation. Finally, this is the hourly wage in Mexico 2 years ago. And you can see the average wage was $2.57. Put in perspective, and I can tell you for true, right now, the average remains the same to a great extent. And the challenges for labor from the specialists right now include all these 6 pillars: jobs, rights, wages, social protection, equality and inclusion. And and they are crossed over by the COVID type disruptions, climate change, and the industrial transition. And this has allowed us to put in perspective that the difficulties that are behind trying to transform labor model, they even, if just suppose in one point that they are able to impact in some labor rights or in some extent in wages, at the end there are all these variables in the equation that are not easy to move. So I leave it here. So great.
Thanks so much, Alex. It's an interesting and provocative presentation. And your writing is very timely, and there's a lot of layers that you've exposed, and that until recently were not exposed in the labor market in Mexico. Thank you for doing that work, and thanks for sending it to us for your contribution to that to our collection. I'm a little embarrassed to say I wish he wasn't here or could hear this, but I'll say it anyway. Basil Kazaz was a student of mine in the Masters of Engineering and Public Policy program at McMaster University, and I'll deny it if he asks me about it again, but he's the best student I've ever had. And so I'm really pleased that he decided to take on automotive research in general and work with the Automotive Policy Research Center, of which I'm a part, and Alex is a part of as well, and Thomas is a part of, Thomas Clear is a part of as well. And he works directly with Charlotte Yates. And Charlotte and Basil have put this next presentation together, Basil mostly, because Charlotte has this other day job called president of the University of Guelph. So Basil, you can speak, and I will run your slides for you. I'm working for you now.
Perfect. Sorry, can you hear me? Okay,
Yes.
perfect. So first of all, thanks, Greg, for the really nice introduction. Greg is actually the person who got me into this field of research, and since then I'm still there. I'm stuck, so I guess that's it. I mean, first of all, I just want to thank Greg and Bruce for coordinating the session. I also want to thank my co-authors, Dr. Charlotte Yates and Sarah Norton, for their work and contribution to this chapter. Our chapter looked at the North American electric vehicle supply chain, and it looked at its implications for Canada's automotive industry, specifically Canada's vehicle parts manufacturing industry. So the shift towards electric vehicles has its implications on supply chain dynamics, has its implications on trade, has its implications on how and where vehicles are assembled and manufactured. So over the past decades, the North American automotive landscape, as Greg mentioned, has been evolving since 1965. The Canada-US Auto Pact, up until NAFTA, and recently the USMCA, ever-evolving supply chain, but mostly driven by policy, geopolitical, and economic factors. Now, the new variable, or over the past, let's say, decade or 5 years, the shift towards EV production has been, or will be, moving forward, the main driver, or one of the drivers, the supply chain. So we have new supply chain dynamics, and based on the work that we've done and the research and the data that we looked up, we found that this may imply further shift away from the Great Lakes automotive cluster. So in 1999, Canada's automotive share was at 17.3, which was at its highest, but in 2021, it dropped to around 8.3%, which is the lowest since the 1960s. So a major shift and restructuring. But now, so part of the work is exploring the implications of this shift on specifically Canada's vehicle parts manufacturing industry. Next slide, please. So fundamental changes, and here it's not only fundamental changes to the vehicle and vehicle technology, it's more as of fundamental changes to the automotive manufacturing supply chain, specifically a supply chain around a battery-focused supply chain or battery-focused manufacturing supply chain. Some research shows that around 70% of a BEV's parts may be different from the parts of an ICEV with more electrical and electronic components, which replace the powertrain and the engine components, which are more mechanically complex. The battery is at the core of the vehicle, and it's also at the core of the supply chain, accounting for around 30 to 40% of the total cost. And more than 50% of the components may be derived or can be derived from the traditional tier one automotive supply chain, which is a big change and a big shift in the supply chain dynamics. Next slide, please. So first of all, we looked at the US and Canada automotive supply chain and trade dynamics. So some of what we found is, first of all, in terms of parts exports, Canada relies on Canada heavily relies on exports of automotive parts, specifically parts such as engines and powertrain parts, which account for over 45% of Canada's parts exports, the $12.5 billion, and specifically it relies on the Midwest region. So proximity is a factor, is a definite factor here, and so the share of parts exports to the Midwest region exceeds the share of the production in the Midwest region. So again, proximity is a factor. We also looked at the early indicators, and this is still early indicators. We're still in the first couple of years of this transition and BEV investment and production allocation. And we compared it to traditional production capacity, and we found that more production is shifting towards the South, and some more production is being allocated to the West. That's mainly driven by new automotive players. But these are some of the early indicators of the planned, current and planned production capacity of battery electric vehicles. Next slide, please. So in our analysis of the US EV and battery manufacturing supply chain, and these again are early indicators, but they have some significance to how Canada's automotive industry over the upcoming year takes shape, and the northern cluster, which is the Great Lakes, which includes the Midwest region and Ontario, takes shape. So moving forward, the battery manufacturing supply chain will be at the center of OEM's planning and investment decision. So we looked at 4 different factors: the import of battery parts and components. This is going to be an important factor, especially as production ramps up. And in any case of possible shortages or the need to import some parts, there will be a high dependence on battery component imports from Asia, the well-developed market, and Europe, the market that may be a bit ahead of North America. So this will draw some production and some investment towards coastal locations such as the South and the West. We looked at mines and critical minerals. We found that 2 main regions are currently the active in this regard in the US, more specifically the West, Nevada, California, Utah, and Arkansas and South Carolina in the South. Location of battery manufacturers and suppliers, we found that there's some increased production capacity and increased activities in the US South and West, which is disproportional with the traditional automotive production. And finally, technology. And technology is not only in the sense of electrification technology, it's also in the sense of autonomous vehicles. It's also in the sense of connected vehicles and vehicle infotainment technologies, which are not relevant to this chapter, but also are a factor in the developing vehicle and the developing supply chain. So we know that there is a bigger role for non-traditional suppliers, mostly that are located on the West Coast, and some more automotive companies locating their R&D activities there. Next slide, please. So challenges and policy, and this is specifically for Canada's automotive industry. And moving forward, it's not only the challenge of maintaining the North American automotive production share, but it's also the dissipation of share of automotive exports. If there's a shift towards the South and some shift towards the West, This will result in, again, a disproportionate investment and production distribution, and this will affect the output of Canada's automotive industry. And policy in this sense is very important. Now, we have some good indicators in Canada's automotive industry, but we're still working on a broader national strategy for the development of this EV and battery supply chain. And it's also to maintain Canada's automotive production share and maintain the value add of this industry to Canada's economy. So that's my chapter. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you, Basil. Picking up on some of the themes that Basil discussed today, I wanted to talk about one of the chapters that I've had a hand in writing for this, and it's about it's about what I call the trifurcation, which shows that of the North American automotive industry and what relevance that particularly has. So again, this is obviously the slide that I showed you before, but the real challenge that countries like Canada, these semi-periphery countries, is that they really have an ambiguous source of competitive advantage. They're not low cost, like Mexico, like any of those other 12 or 15 countries listed on the right-hand side, and they do not have the political and powerful heft that core automotive countries have by virtue of their default as the low cost, as the location for investment. So they struggle, and it's not just Canada, but it's also the UK. UK no longer obviously has its own indigenous automaker. Spain is starting to struggle from that. Austria, Belgium, Sweden, and to a smaller degree, Finland as well. And this has been happening since the year 2000. As recently as 22 years ago, just about 70% of vehicle production was made in the 25 wealthiest countries around the world. That was the notion was that advanced manufacturing had to occur in economically advanced countries. And we've subsequently found that it's not the case. As recently as 2019, it's difficult. I had a conversation with somebody this morning. What year do we pick as the normalized year? Is it 2019? Is it 2021 again? When do we pick up, because 2020 was such a write-off? But as recently as 2019, that number of 69.3% had dropped to 25.9%. And that's, of course, that's not just because wealthy countries' production had dropped, but it's also because the integrated periphery or countries that straddle both of them, like India and China, for example, had elevated themselves. So this problem in the semi-periphery, as given evidence by Canada in North America, but also these countries in Europe, Canada's problem is not alone. So we've moved from 16.7% of regional production in Canada as recently as 2000 to, as Basil said, 8.3% today in 2021. But the European semi-peripheries have experienced similar, although not quite as drastic, reductions from 31% in the year 2000 to 23.14% today, but that number is on the decline. So in Canada, the industrial policy area has buffeted from a series of ideas over the course of the last 22 years or so, as they've tried to buttress themselves against this unending trend. And some of this is automotive policy, and frankly, some of it is industrial narratives. And there's a difference between narratives and policy. So around industrial policy, we've seen a really strong use and reliance on automotive incentives in Canada. So over the years 2000 to 2022, I've looked at 21 projects that have had incentives in Canada of over $100 million. Only 2 of them were for new greenfield operations. One was just a few months ago for a Stellantis LG battery plant in Windsor, Ontario, with a $1 billion incentive package from the province of Ontario and the government of Canada, which is interesting in and of itself that the government of Canada is involved. The other as far back as 2005, which I was a part of when I was at Toyota for a new Toyota plant in Woodstock, Ontario, before Toyota decided that they could make lots of vehicles and do well in Mexico. So 2 greenfields, 2 bailout. The cost for the bailouts of 2008-09 have been estimated in Canada at 3.7 billion. This is Canadian dollars, and 17 refurbishments. So this is we're doing a new model. Or we're doing a model change and we need a little bit of help. We're doing a model change and we'd really like it to be in Canada, but we need a little bit of help. 17 of those have been for refurbishments, and I know that it happens in the US to a degree, but certainly not to the same level. And Kristen and I have had a conversation about this. It happens in the US, but not to the same degree. These are grants. Not non-payable or loans where the payback is in 40 years at the same dollar level as they went out at. And they don't tend to do those anymore, but you can essentially consider them to be grants of 4.3 billion for 17 refurbishments or model changes. So that's the primary tool that Canada and Ontario have used to secure the base, although the base has moved from 3 million to 1.1 million over the past 22 years. But there's also been this series of industrial policy narratives, and you heard a little bit about them this morning, about Canada's high quality automotive workforce, for example, which did make some sense in the early parts of this century, but subsequently Canada's high quality workforce the automotive industry in Canada as the alpha employer pays the best, gets the best people, has the best benefits, has dissipated as Canadian industry has tried to buttress the onslaught, if you will, in the rise of the U.S. South and Mexico. And they pay a little bit less. They have these long growing periods, defined benefit pension plans have given way to defined contributions. You got to stick around for a number of years to get them. So the alpha employer argument, and therefore able to make the very best, highest quality vehicles, has evaporated. And we've subsequently realized that high quality vehicles can be made with workforces that don't have that are not employed by these so-called alpha employers, the automotive OEMs. Second is a transition to a knowledge-intensive profile, and Flavio, to his credit, has a very good narrative around that. But the reality is, there are individual positive stories around the transition for the Canadian automotive industry to a more knowledge-intensive profile. But if you look at automotive R&D over the past since 2000, the numbers the inputs in terms of dollars spent has been pretty much the same every year, without even accounting for inflation, around $400 million, which will last about 400 hours in one of the big OEMs. So that hasn't gone particularly well from an inputs perspective. The ratio of or the percentage of automotive patents that have come out of Canada have moved from about 1% in the year 2000 to half of 1% global automotive patents from Canada as recently as 2018 or so. And then there's this mines to mobility narrative that we've heard this morning, and we've seen some investments in automotive production. And do you characterize them as model changes as they transition to battery electric vehicles? Maybe in an optimistic sense, or maybe they're just model changes, or maybe they really do hearken a new and progressive future for the Canadian automotive industry that has yet to emerge. But the mines, they take 10 years to put together. They are, the minerals are 1,000 miles away from the road infrastructure. Canada does not have a long history or a very aggressive history of saying, if you want to use these materials, you must process them here. You must put them in batteries here. So it's not to be, it hasn't been determined whether this mines to mobility slogan will actually manifest in strong investment levels going forward. So this is difficult for the automotive industry in Canada, and the question is this trifurcated formula, the model that I showed you, does it eventually squeeze itself out and become more polarized so that we see, so that will the semi-peripheries graduate to the status of core? Maybe not, probably not. Will they revert to integrated periphery? I don't think they want that either. But where will they ultimately end up? It's the challenge is manufacturing mandates are continuing to be absorbed into the integrated peripheries. We've seen that. And we've also seen overtures to skew higher value, more knowledge intensive mandates are being rebuffed by the core. So Canada might have a good story, but does the core countries, the OEMs in the core, are they really interested in those stories? And time will tell where that goes. The final presentation, and I don't think I see Bertha here now, but we do have this sort of belts. Oh, there she is, just on time. So Bertha, take it away, and I will drive for you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for everybody. It's really nice to be here. I apologize if my network fails. Let's hope it doesn't happen. I'm now in Tanzania and Arusha, and the electricity has been a little bit difficult these days. Okay, so I will present a chapter that is called The Automotive Industry in Mexico and the Challenges of a New Era, Perspective on Electric Vehicles and Green Technologies. This is a chapter that is co-authored with Professor Jorge Carrillo, Victor Cabral, and Dr. Humberto Garcia Jimenez. The next slide, please. The chapter takes Mexico as case study, and it explores the effects of the auto industry's technological transformation on the integrated peripheries. It also explores the changes in the environmental discourse, in the policies, in the standards, and the initiatives in the core automotive countries, and how does these changes affect the non-core places, the semi and the integrated periphery. And finally, it also explores the factors that influence the consumer choice for electric vehicles and internal combustion engines vehicles. This next slide, please. The automotive industry is one of the examples, the typical example of an industry that is locking in a technology, in this case on the ICE. So we use technology push policies as a tool to disrupt the industry's path dependency, and through them we stimulate the development of cleaner technologies. So by increasing or the way the social and environmental pressures that are ongoing now are increasing, there is a higher or a stronger push for the creation of new paths. And this creation of new paths have important consequences in the auto industry and also in the transport sector. And this is not something simple. As Russell commented before, this has strong influences on the way the automotive value chain is organized. It implies a fewer number of suppliers, less components in the vehicles, a new way infrastructure, a new way of producing it. So it really has important and expensive consequences. So the chapter identifies regulatory measures, changes in consumers' habits and practices, and technological breakthroughs as elements that also contribute to this technology change. So as Greg mentioned before, when we analyze the automotive integrated periphery, we should consider two things. First, that is highly dependent on the strategic decisions that are taken in the core countries, in the headquarters, and it's also highly vulnerable to them. And the second condition is that, and this is very, very well explored in the literature, is that there is a weak link between the foreign subsidiaries and the domestic or the local firms. So most of the time, this link never really happens. So finally, we have the findings of the chapter. The chapter identifies the main environmental standards and mandates that are implemented in the European Union, in the United States, and in China as the most relevant technology forcing regulations. It also highlights how fiscal incentives and the availability of publicly accessible chargers are complementing these policies and encourage the acquisition of electric vehicles over the last years. So another significant factor in the success of technology forcing regulation is the credibility of the regulatory agency, which determines how the industry will respond to the policy. So we have 4 elements that are very important. So one is the environmental standards and the mandates, the regulations, the fiscal incentives, the availability of the accessible charges, and the credibility of the implementing agency. And then we bring it to our conclusion. So we know now that technology push policies or technology forcing regulations are a trigger for a transition and breaks technological path dependency. However, we also find with the case of Mexico that technological lock-in is not only about the technology itself, but it's also about the sociopolitical and institutional dependencies in place. In this case, in the chapter, we explore trends from the past, and then we identify a constant increase in the number of electric vehicles that are acquired in the country. We also identify in the past a lot of initiatives and proposals for investments towards this type of vehicles, and also identify agreements and investment proposals for the extraction of lithium and the production of batteries. However, we also notice a disruption when the discourse, the political discourse changes and it moves towards the promotion of dirty technologies, lower the incentives for green technologies, and it creates an environment, which is a change, creates an environment that desensitizes the investors because there is a lack or unclear national plan. So this shows how unreformed sociopolitical context acts as a lock-in, and it doesn't only prevent new investment in the electric vehicles production, but it also motivates or disincentivizes strongly investors that are already in the country. And I want to finalize with that. Thank you.
So Alex identified some challenges associated with taking advantage of the adjustments that are going on in the Mexican automotive industry from a labor perspective, and then ultimately from the perspective of the workers, and are they going to generate the riches that the automotive industry makes available, in which the world and policymakers chase with such enthusiasm. Meanwhile, Bertha has identified some of the challenges that Mexico, from a policy perspective, will and are experiencing or not embracing as the world starts that transition or continues that transition to an electrified future. Meanwhile, Basil and I have share a common perspective that the transition, regardless of the propulsion system, is difficult for these countries like Canada, the automotive semi-periphery. So what we've tried to do with this presentation is, yes, focus on the post NAFTA period and going beyond, obviously, and into the USMCA, but not focusing strictly on the USMCA, as Kristen in her chapter in our book makes very clear. The USMCA can't be identified as the cause of all growth or the cause of all challenges. And it's difficult to isolate any particular element. But what we've tried to do is gather some of the key issues and trends that are confronting the industry in North America in general. And today we focused on the non-core, being Mexico and Canada in North America. So this raises lots of questions, and I'm sure that you have perspectives, comments, questions. We're here to, if not give you an answer, we'll certainly try our hand at a response, which might not be exactly the same thing. So, anybody with anything? Did I see a hand? I feel like I'm at an auction or something. Oh, Thomaso, you're saving us.
Okay. I saw that in your presentation, you were showing volumes, and that's what we do. When we think about the automotive industry, we always think about how many million of cars are produced in this country, how many million of cars are produced in that one. And we've been thinking in these terms for decades. But my feeling is that when we saw this morning that some cars have an average price of $60,000 and other cars have an average price of 30, the hybrid, and the conventional car is $20,000. I think we need to think, and we connect that with the added value of these cars. And I think that perhaps if we start to think in terms of value added, and I know that you do also, the picture that you get start to be different. And I have the feeling that in Europe, for instance, because I know better the European situation, clearly when you look at the geography of value added, you really realize what is the core, what is the semi-periphery, and what is that the value, it amplifies that much more, that the core is where all the value added is created and concentrated and brought back. The semi-periphery are places where you have in Europe, you have some flexible specialization that still allows us to capture a certain degree of value added. And then the distant periphery is where you have all the volumes, but no value added. The value added is very small. So my question is, if you look at in terms of value added, the dynamic of USMCA, do you think that USMCA is going to change this perspective in terms of the fact that most of the value is in the core and then the semi-periphery and the distant periphery gets less and less of this value? And what do you think about the role of electrification here? Do you think that is going to accentuate this disparity between regions in terms of capacity of capturing value in these new technologies, or we can work in the other way around?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting perspective that you bring. I mean, I show you this model framework, if you will, here, and the top half is built primarily, as you said, on the way we've traditionally looked at the automotive industry, being production volumes. And it's understandable, and it's easy to get our arms around. And frankly, even if we'd said, what is the value added in the aggregate from those countries, we probably have most of those same countries in the same categories as we do right now. But I think, to your point, it would raise some interesting subsequent discussions that we can't even anticipate, perhaps, or maybe some of you can anticipate where those would go right now. But then the bottom half of this in terms of key attributes, some of those items are quantifiably based, but honestly, a lot of them are more intuition than others, and I think that if we looked at it from a value added perspective or some other perspective, we'd find some other stories. Maybe we validate this and give it a little more heft, which would be useful in and of itself. my sense of the automotive industry as it has evolved over the past 120 years or so, and my sense of how it is starting to evolve over the last 5 years is that this framework is persisting, and that the numbers on value added from a research perspective, even though, and the geographers in this room know about how ideas can move, and the discussions of innovation economies, and how ideas don't have to be in proximity to the OEMs in the source of power. But my sense is that over time, these notions will be reinforced. What we've seen as an example, with what I've noticed is those top 100 suppliers in Canada. It would sense that the strong sense in the automotive industry may be more unique than other places, the other industries rather, or sectors, is that when automotive suppliers reach a certain point, and they at their outset, most of their research is done in proximity to their headquarters. And that makes perfect sense. And that's what happens in sectors all around the world. But once they reach a certain point, a certain size, they become large enough, sophisticated enough that they can extricate their R&D from their headquarters and their original sources of production. And then it becomes more important for them to become in proximity to their customers. And this is what we've seen in the top 4 suppliers in Canada. At one point in time, they did most of their R&D next door or in proximity to in Canada. But when they hit a certain point, or a certain, typically, but in terms, what I've seen is around $1 billion, they say, okay, this has been great, but we need to be close to our customers, and therefore we need to set up an R&D center in Michigan. Or we need to set up another R&D center in Austria, because there's some unique connections with Magna there, or we need to set up something in proximity to one of our major customers in Southeast Asia. But primarily for Canada, it's Michigan. They move out of Newmarket. They move their R&D out of Guelph. They move their R&D out of Toronto. They focus it in proximity to their customers. So long-winded response to your good question, but I think this has legs. But the lesson I take from your comments, Thomas, is that perhaps we could find a way to more specifically and graphically categorize some of these elements. Yeah, Alex. Oh, I see another hand though.
Sorry, I just want to take the opportunity of the Tommaso question to say, to introduce a different perspective. Tommaso says, okay, always we have been discussing in terms of statistics. Where is exactly the numbers? We say we can put perhaps right now value. Where is the added value? And I would say that put it in this way also lead us to probably to the same figures in a different way, but the same figures. Right now, we see and we talk about this huge transition of the auto sector. There is a huge transition of the key industry related to the auto sector, including energy, mobility is different way of mobilities, and connection and digitalization. So, and then it comes the pandemic. Right now, my point is we need to discuss and find a different way to discuss exactly what is the industry in each place. And we need to include what is the sustainability of the industry? What is the sustainability of the industry? And then what is the resilience of the industry in each place? It's a completely different game. And the variables that we so far not including the discussion, or we put behind, including labor. when we talk about sustainability and we talk about resilience, labor is going back again in the middle of the transition. It's just to be a little provocative, if you wish.
Basil or Bertha, do you have any perspective on that? I'm going to put you on the spot. And if you don't, that's okay too.
No, absolutely. So I'll add a couple of things. I mean, we're seeing, and I'll go back to the new supply chain dynamics. And this is regarding the second part of the question. So in terms of how the supply chain is evolving, we're seeing more of partnerships taking place. For example, Ford and SK Innovation, LG and Stellantis, Panasonic and Tesla, and many other collaborations and partnerships to produce not only the vehicles and the batteries, but also to develop the technologies. Now, it's not only that the OEMs now have a perspective in this, but also the new players in the supply chain, which have a perspective in the allocation of resources and the allocation of, let's say, R&D, production, and different parts of the supply chain. The other perspective is, I mean, we saw a lot of R&D assets being developed in places which are non-traditional automotive regions, and this is a factor. We've seen, we're seeing other trends. So it's new perspectives, it's new variables which account for the allocation of production and allocation of assets. So there are different indicators, and it's evolving. So as we speak, I think many decisions are being made, and they're taking a lot of perspectives and indicators which we are not looking at and accounting for in our studies.
Bertha?
I also want to add that this is just a reflection after the question made. I think that you have this change in technological path to the EVs, but you also have alternative technologies, and I think that we are not talking about this. I mean, we mentioned it in the chapter, how not every country has the ability or the capabilities to move toward this, which seems to be the trend, the EVs. And there are other options like other type of technologies, and also the option of staying where they are. So there are, I think in the years coming, there will be a lot of changes in the way we map and in the way we see the auto industry, because it's not going to be only one production way, but we will have a diversity or a variety of models taken by different countries. And I think in the chapter we try to mention how countries like Pakistan and even India are promoting more these kind of vehicles that also use I'm sorry, in the English word, this type of different kind of biodiesel, bio. Sorry, my mind got blocked. But you have this type of hybrids vehicles that you are producing there, and they were not popular. For example, they're not popular in Mexico, they're popular in Brazil. And you also have others that go really for the EVs, and you have others like Mexico that is betting on the ICEs. So I have the impression that you will see this diversity, and it will be very interesting to see, how long it will last. You cannot talk about the EVs in Africa. It was very hard to get connection to this conference. So you can have this you cannot ignore that the reality of the world is not ready to go together and at the same step for this transition, to this technological transition. Thank you.
Thomas? All right, thank you, Greg, and thank you all the panelists. This was an incredibly focused and well-sorted presentation. So you spoke to the power of the paradigm that's currently on the slide. And I like a paradigm as much as the next person. And I wonder what the power of the paradigm is if you turn it like you have at times during the presentations of the panel, turn it into a paradigm that allows us to tell a story. In other words, turn it from a static paradigm that allows us a dynamic explanation of what we might be seeing in the near future, right? So as you look at the countries there, on the core side, that's, I think there's 6 countries, right? So that's, the remnant of the triad is there. You go to the semi-periphery, you have almost all Europe and then Canada. And then for the integrated periphery, you got a lot of stuff there, and that's where the hidden dynamic is, I think, in this paradigm. And the one country, so that's my question here, the 500-pound gorilla that's not on this table is China. So wondering if China is the one that's going to bust up this paradigm, or how would you tell the story of China? Where is it going to end up, and where is it now? That's my question.
Thanks, Thomas. You have exposed the fact that my cut and paste skills are not well refined, because if I had cut and paste and properly grouped as I should have, you would see, there would be China and India would be placed there, and India would be placed there, which is a really interesting and powerful dynamic. You were going with this in terms of the dynamic moving ahead was I see 2 really important facets, India and China aside. One is this continued move, this polarization rather than trifurcation, and this shrinking of the semi-periphery. But I think the other part, and I haven't heard anybody really talk about it today, is this notion of power. And where does power reside in the automotive industry, and where will power reside going forward? Because traditionally the automotive industry, as we all know, that the internal combustion engine has represented probably 30%, give or take, of the value of the vehicle, and that 30% has always been resided, with a few niche exceptions, with the OEM in which that engine is lodged, or an engine and transmission is lodged. Now we have these new actors that we didn't even know about 10 years ago, in terms of the automotive industry, and absorbing an enormous amount, or 30% of the power or of the value of the vehicle, and perhaps 30% of the value within the automotive power chain. So what happens to does that dilute the power of the traditional OEMs, and how does that shake out? That we see these battery plants are coming in as joint ventures, but are they really joint ventures, or are they we'll take a little bit of your money, thank you very much, and you are now as an OEM our customer, and we're not going to share with you all of the knowledge and detail. We'll let you come in on a Thursday morning and have a look at what we're doing in our battery plant, but we're going to control it. And so these become important discussions going forward. And then meanwhile, we see other countries still trying to chase the value add and economic potential that automotive manufacturing represents. And TOG, for example, in Turkey, which probably a lot of people haven't even heard about, has my estimate, has received commitments of $4.5 billion from the government of Turkey to build an auto plant and build a company, and they want to be the next Tesla, but man, it's going to be very difficult because they don't have the power and they're not building their own battery. They're getting their battery from Therasis in China. So that's where the power will reside. And it's not going to be a whole lot different than an assembly plant that's looking to try to sell vehicles in a rich market. So these whole power dynamics are really interesting, and the electrification of powertrains should fundamentally change power dynamics over the next 10 to 15 years. And what happens once a battery becomes a commodity, if it does become a commodity? How do those dynamics revert? These are all the questions that people in this room can be starting to answer and research in ways that, frankly, a lot of the industry are reluctant to divulge. Yeah. Yeah. No, yeah. Come up here.
This is a great chart, Art Wheaton from Cornell ILR School. And I love the idea when you talked about putting China in two places, putting India in two places. And I would argue you need to put the United States in two places, where you have the Midwest and you have the right to work for less states, which is getting a disproportionate amount of the future investment. And I love the idea of having power there. Is the idea behind the joint ventures is that they don't have, if you put them in a right to work state, you don't have to have organized labor as part of that, because you're not part of General Motors, you are part of LG Chemical or something else to be able to do that. So I think the power dynamics, I think, is also a major component that's in there. And I think you're seeing a disproportionate amount of investment in the US to avoid or weaken the power of organized labor and to put it in right to work states, so you can have a lower cost investment to put it more towards your integrated periphery for the right to work states. So I don't know if that's true or not, but that's the impression from where I'm sitting is what it looks like. Because when you saw the chart that showed the amount of investment in the southern states in Texas, and especially in Kentucky and Tennessee for all the new battery investment, that's just a comment.
That's in that. So Alec wanted to comment on that. I think Basil, you'll probably have some perspective on
No,
that.
yes, in the same vein. I mean, this is for me, this is great. I admire great work and all the people, but I wonder, this is could by nations. But in the same thing, for instance, in the case of Canada, what do you think in Canada? Can we think in terms of nations, thinking about regions instead of region? Or how about if we start thinking in terms of integrated regions, where Canada is completely integrated to this American region, and probably other countries, more than look at as a countries, we need to see it as regions. In my case, I would like to keep this, but crossed by regions also.
Basil, can I put
Yeah.
you back on the spot?
Yeah,
and talk about-
absolutely,
You
absolutely.
want me to find you back to that, your way back to that slide? I got to get through the 8,275 that Alex had. I'm just teasing you, Alex. There.
Okay, no, I kind of agree with Alex. I mean, we're looking more of, and how I like to describe it, it's a cluster. So the Midwest Ontario cluster, and I'm sure it's described as such in almost all research. The southern and Mexico cluster, but we have some more regions taking a role in this new supply chain. Now, the other perspective is, Canada moving forward, or Canada as of recently got the announcement of LG and Stellantis. Now, does that change these numbers? Yes, it does. But does that shift the narrative? I don't think it shifts the narrative. I think we're seeing new trends. I think we're seeing new dynamics. I think the US as a core country will still have its role. I think Canada was a bit late to the party, and Mexico is yet to join. Although we've had a new announcement from GM of a $1 billion investment to manufacture EVs, but still no investment or no major investment around batteries. So overall, the US will remain will have its role in terms of research, in terms of the production capacity, in terms of the market share and sales, in terms of politics, policy, geopolitical, and economic power. So I think regions are very relevant, but the US also in terms of the policies of the US administration, which I think are more protectionist policies, but they benefit the industry there at this stage of investment, because it's an early stage, but it's a very relevant stage to capture a bigger share. So that's my perspective.
This early stage of EVs is very vexing. It should be considered to be more challenging than I think perhaps some policymakers lead us to believe. Because the being early stage, when we saw the presentation, for example, from Mike Jackson this morning, when you're early stage and you realize that you've got this mandate to build 2 new vehicles, electrified vehicles, and then you start to do the math and you realize that it's 43,000 and then another 43,000 maybe in your plant that has a capacity of 300,000, then you start to think, maybe I shouldn't have been first, maybe I should have been in the middle, or maybe I should have been last. And so in terms of this transition to our electrified future, because that transition is going to be very, very chaotic. And I know that Thomas Clear and James Rubenstein have written about some of those aspects, and others have as well. And so, but I'm interested, Bertha, in your presentation, because you mentioned, and it's true, that Mexico hasn't necessarily reaped the benefits yet of or had the announcements in volume about the transition to electrified vehicles. And your premise is that they haven't taken the proper measures to do so and haven't put in place the policies to affect that transition. But someone might argue that Mexico's only policy to affect the policies that were in place for Mexico to be successful as a producer of vehicles with an internal combustion engine are very similar: low cost and access to lots of different markets, be they in North America or elsewhere. So I'd like you to kind of peel that away a little bit more about why you think this is such a problem, because I'm not sure I quite get it yet.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, all things constant, Mexico has the same scenarios. The difference here, and that's why that was my presentation and our paper, our chapter is about, is that you need 4 elements, as I mentioned in my presentation. And one very important element is the credibility of the agency that is implementing the changes or promoting the changes. And that is not there. When the new administration came into power, the narrative changed. And there has been a lot of discourse on promotion of dirty technologies. It has been a lot of discourse and lowering of incentives towards greener, green technologies. And the political narrative gives the impression of a very poor and inconsistent national plan. And that macro signals are very, I mean, investors take them, foreign investors particularly, take them very seriously. Because you are not going to put your investment, strong investments, in a place where the political stability is not clear. And I think that is a factor that is acting now as a lock-in. So there are many changes in the political narrative that will have or are having strong impacts on the economic decisions that are being taken in the country. So I agree with you. I think Mexico has the technological capability. It has the skill, human capital for this. It has several conditions. It has a history on automotive production. But if the political narrative keeps increasing the uncertainty that is now in the country, because in the last years has been increasing the uncertainty, that is a red focus that is not taken lightly. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, Mike, go ahead. You want to run up? Or saunter up?
I'll try to ask a question that has a yes/no answer. So I've been involved in a couple trade disputes. So the automotive rules for NAFTA were complex. My reading is that the automotive rules for USMCA are even more complex. But you've done an exemplary job of pointing out a number of long-run trends. I've heard nothing indicating that USMCA makes a difference. So does it make a difference? Yes, no. And if yes, maybe one example of where.
Lots of people would disagree with me, but if I have to choose between yes and no, does it make a difference? I'd say no, not much. I was in that industry for a long time, and we monitored our North American content of everything coming through. I don't remember ever hearing an investment decision on the basis of NAFTA requirements, because when I was directly employed in the industry, that's what it was. Every now and again, we'd run up close to about our content requirements on a vehicle because the engine was not enough engines were coming from West Virginia, for example, and we'd have a discussion about that. But I don't remember anybody ever saying we need to do anything specifically because of it. But it hasn't. I'm sure it has an effect, but I don't see that as top of mind. And Kristen has a different view of that.
I was holding back, but USMCA has two things that are unique, I think, that are different than what you were talking about with NAFTA. One is the labor value content, which we talked about in Alex's presentation, and then the core parts rule. So a lot of the electric vehicles currently sold in the United States are low content vehicles. We are importing a lot of the content of those vehicles. The US is the main market for electric vehicles. So if you make them in the US, you sell them in the US, you don't need to meet the content rule. So I wanted to know if you could talk about how those content rules play to 2.5%. Yes, but you don't, have to pay a tariff of 15 into Mexico or 6 point whatever into Canada for those that you produce in the US with low content. So you don't think it's mannering?
Is it an issue?
Yeah.
Yes. Is it the issue?
Okay.
Maybe we may agree.
Well, I think there's,
Be more definitive.
I do. I think there's that. There was also a proposal that's not going anywhere about that you would get higher consumer incentives if your vehicles were built here. That may have played some of, for the investments made in this 4 years, that may be playing here too. But yeah, I think, the set the content rule very high and then just, build it in the US, sell it in the US and don't care is where we are.
In defense of your premise, if it was.
Come on,
if
you can
there
have that.
wasn't- If there wasn't, in the absence of any factors, we'd make all of our vehicles in Mexico. We'd find the cheapest
Yes.
place but there's political factors at play.
Yes.
There's political factors at play. And if we just made it if we just went to the cheapest place, all the cars in North America would be built in Mexico, and all the cars built in Europe would be built in North Africa, and that'd be the end of the story. But this is a much more dynamic situation than that. And tariff rates are a factor, but they're not the only factor that generates these things. And I thought that was a point you were making before. And how to quantify it? Difficult discussions. Yeah.
Okay. Time for a break. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Basil. Thank you, Bertha.